Sophie Blake, an ordinary waitress, unexpectedly receives a job offer from powerful billionaire Edward Sterling after helping his son in a difficult moment. Having found herself in the world of big business, she faces envy, prejudice, and setups, but she is not going to give up. When a scandal shakes the company, all the evidence points to Sophie, and even Edward begins to doubt her honesty. But the truth always comes out, and the final choice will show who really stands for each other. Don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss new stories. Sophie Blake wiped her hands on her apron and looked around the half-empty diner. It was close to midnight, and the cafe was already winding down. The tables had been cleared, the floor had been mopped, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee still hung in the air. She stretched tiredly and looked at her watch. 11:47 p.m. Just a little bit left, and she could go home. Sophie cleared the last of the glasses from the counter when she suddenly noticed a figure outside the window. Outside, in the pouring rain, sat a boy in a wheelchair. He didn't move, his hands were on his knees and his head was slightly lowered. Sophie frowned. What is he doing here alone at such a late hour? She quickly took off her apron, threw it on the counter, and headed for the exit. When she opened the door, a gust of wind and cold drops of rain hit her face. But she had no time for that. Hey baby, are you okay? The boy looked up at her. Big brown eyes, tired and sad. Yes, just waiting. Sophie looked around. No cars, no people. Alone? Where are your parents? He shrugged. Dad has to pick me up. He's a little late. Sophie looked around skeptically. It was raining cats and dogs, and the boy was clearly shivering from the cold. Listen, why don't you wait for him inside? It's warm here, I'll pour you some hot chocolate. The boy hesitated, but then nodded slowly. Sophie reached behind the back of the chair and carefully rolled it into the cafe. Once they were inside, the boy relaxed a little. What's your name? Sophie asked, placing a mug of hot chocolate in front of him. Nico. A beautiful name. Nico smiled uncertainly and took the mug. The first sips, and his face lit up with warmth. Tasty. Sophie chuckled. I know. He's the best in town. She walked up to the counter, pulled out a plate and placed the sandwich on it. Here, this is for you too. I can't. I don't have money. Sophie met his gaze. I didn't ask you to pay. The boy looked at her in confusion, then carefully took the sandwich. She saw that he was hungry, but he tried not to show it. Sophie didn't know how much time passed, but she forgot about the clock as she watched Nico eat and warm up. Suddenly the cafe door swung open. A tall man in an expensive suit, soaked in the rain, stood on the threshold. His dark eyes scanned the room carefully until they landed on Nico. The boy raised his head. Dad! Sophie froze. This man? Her heart sank. She knew him. Edward Sterling. Billionaire. Owner of Sterling Global Enterprises. One of the most influential people in the city. And now he was standing in her cafe, looking at her appraisingly. Nico smiled happily. Dad, Sophie gave me hot chocolate and a sandwich. I waited for you here so I wouldn't get wet in the rain. Edward didn't take his eyes off Sophie. Did you help him? His voice was deep and calm, but there was something more to it. Sophie nodded. He was alone. And frozen. I just couldn't leave him there. Edward stepped forward slowly, his gaze unusually soft. Thank you? Sophie didn't know what to say. She expected anything. Cold arrogance, a dry gesture of gratitude, maybe even an accusation that she was meddling in something that wasn't her business. But he was truly grateful. And at that moment she didn't yet know that this act would change her life. Sophie couldn't get the meeting with Edward Sterling out of her mind. After that evening when he picked up his son from the cafe, she continued to work as usual, but something inside her changed. She wondered, why did this man, the billionaire owner of the corporation, look so confused at that moment? Maybe it was Nico. Or was he surprised by her actions? Either way, Sophie was sure of one thing: she simply did what she thought was right. The next day, She was finishing her shift when a black sedan pulled up outside her window. A man in a formal suit emerged from it and confidently walked towards the doors of the cafe. Sophie glanced at him briefly and continued clearing the table. Miss Blake? She raised her head. Yes? My name is Michael Lawson and I work for Sterling Global Enterprises. Sophie frowned. Do you need something? Mr. Sterling would like to meet with you. An hour later, she stood at the entrance to Sterling Global Enterprises. A huge glass skyscraper towered over the city, blinding with sun glare. Sophie was nervous. She didn't understand why she was here. When she walked inside, she was greeted by a woman in a formal suit. Follow me, Mr. Sterling is waiting for you. She led her through spacious corridors where an atmosphere of money, power, and impeccable order reigned. When the door to the office opened, Edward Sterling was sitting at a massive desk, looking through documents. He looked up. Come in, Miss Blake. Sophie took a step inside and froze. His presence was oppressive, but not rudely, but with some kind of calm authority. He gestured to the chair opposite her. I don't understand why I'm here, she said, sitting down. Edward folded his fingers in front of him, studying her carefully. I want to offer you a job. Sophie blinked. What? Work in my company. She shook her head, feeling confusion rising in her chest. You are offering me a job? Why? He paused briefly, then said, Because I need honest people. Sophie didn't know what to say. She expected anything: gratitude, formal politeness, maybe even a donation to the cafe. But work? It seemed absurd. I'm a waitress, Mr. Sterling. I have no corporate experience. He remained unperturbed. You have character. This is more important than experience. Sophie had a hard time digesting what was happening. But why me? He looked at her carefully. Yesterday you helped my son simply because you thought it was right. You didn't know who he was. You weren't trying to get anything in return. She held her breath. And that's why you decided to give me a job? Edward nodded. I want people like you to work alongside me. Sophie walked out of the office, still trying to comprehend what was happening. She was walking down the corridor, lost in thought, when she heard the voices of the staff. Did you hear? The boss brought some waitress. Are you kidding? Who is she? I don't know, but if he decided to take her, it means there's something in her. Or he likes her. Sophie clenched her fists. Even before she started working, she was already faced with bias. But if she agrees, she will prove them wrong. Sophie stood at the entrance to Sterling Global Enterprises, taking a deep breath. Her first day at the company had just begun, and she was already facing prejudice. After Edward Sterling offered her a job, she accepted, but knew she would have to prove she was there for a reason. The whispers of the staff, the skeptical looks, the conversations behind her back, she felt it from the first step. But she wasn't going to back down. There were about 10 people working in the department where she was assigned. When Sophie walked in, everyone was silent for a second. She was met by a man of about 40, with neatly combed back hair. Are you Miss Blake? She nodded, containing her excitement. Yes. I'm John Harris, your immediate supervisor. Follow me. She followed him down the corridor, feeling the glances being cast at her. Some with curiosity, but most with contempt or suspicion. They entered a spacious office. John pointed to the table by the window. This is your workstation. Your job is to help with paperwork, coordinate meetings, and carry out assignments. Is that clear? Yes, sir. John looked at her carefully. If something is unclear, please contact me. But I warn you, no one plays by simplified rules here. If you want to work in this company, you will have to live up to them. I'm not afraid of difficulties. He looked at her for a second, then nodded and left. A few hours later, Sophie was already immersed in work. She was sorting through documents, organizing data, trying to figure out the system, when she heard a woman's voice. The waitress is now playing the businesswoman? Sophie raised her head. Vivian Hale stood before her, an elegant woman with sharp features and piercing eyes. She was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, and her posture exuded confidence and cool authority. Sophie realized that she was facing her main rival. "Do you need something?" she asked calmly. Vivian smiled, but there was a hint of mockery in her eyes. "No. I'm just curious how quickly you can escape from here." Sophie didn't look away. "Why should I run?" "Because you're out of place here." She leaned closer. "Don't have any illusions. He didn't offer you a job because you're talented. He just had something in mind." Sophie's fingers tightened on the table, but her voice remained firm. "I'm not used to giving up." Vivian chuckled. "Let's see." She turned and walked out of the office. But her words stuck in my head. During her lunch break, Sophie went out onto the terrace to get some fresh air. She felt like an outsider. But as soon as she closed her eyes, Nico's face appeared before her, the very boy for whom she was here. Sophie smiled. She won't let them break her. Because she knew she deserved this chance. Sophie was finally beginning to settle into the rhythm of Sterling Global Enterprises. The first days were difficult. Whispers behind her back, arrogant looks, the feeling that she was out of place here. But she didn't give up. She studied documents, observed colleagues, learned on the go, proving to herself that she could be a part of this world. However, she soon realized that the fight was just beginning. The morning began as usual. Sophie arrived at work early as usual, made coffee and immersed herself in tasks. But an hour later something changed. The colleagues spoke in whispers, their gazes directed at her. John Harris, her boss, walked out of the office with a stern expression on his face. "Sophie, to the conference room." Immediately. She froze, her heart sank. When she entered the room, Edward Sterling, Vivian Hale, and several security personnel were already there. Edward sat quietly, but his eyes were cold. Vivian stood nearby, arms crossed, a slight smile on her lips. "Sophie, sit down," Edward said. She slowly sank into the chair, feeling anxiety tightening in her chest. "What's the matter?" Edward didn't take his eyes off her. "This morning we discovered that there was a data leak from our servers." Sophie blinked. "What data?" "Financial. Closed contracts, investment reports." She shook her head, not believing what she heard. "And what am I doing here?" "All traces lead to your account." Sophie took a breath, but it seemed to get stuck in her throat. "This is impossible." "But the facts say otherwise," Vivian interjected, her voice venomous. Sophie looked at her, and everything became clear. She set her up. "Do you think it was me?" Sophie's voice trembled. Edward was silent, looking at her intently. "We have to consider all options, Sophie." She couldn't believe her ears. "After everything she's done, after everything she's been through." He doubted. He admitted that she could betray him. "Do you really believe that I am capable of this?" Edward didn't answer right away. He looked disappointed. "I want to believe that, no." But there was uncertainty in his voice. And that broke her more than Vivian's accusations. Sophie stood up slowly. "If you don't believe me, I have nothing more to do here." "Sophie," Edward began, but she was already heading for the door. Just before leaving, she turned around. "You said you hired me because you needed honest people." She met his gaze and for the first time saw regret in it. "But you couldn't believe in me." And with these words she left. Sophie walked through the streets, not knowing where to go. She felt betrayed, devastated, broken. But deep inside, a new determination was born. She will find the one who set her up. She will prove her innocence. And then he will look into Edward's eyes when he realizes what a mistake he made. Sophie walked along the city streets, not noticing the noise of cars or the voices of passers-by. Edward's last words were spinning in his head. "I want to believe that, no." He didn't believe her. After everything they had been through, after she had worked honestly, he allowed the thought that she was a traitor. That was the most painful part. But if he doesn't believe, she will prove the truth to him. The first thing Sophie did was remember the details of the accusation. Financial leakage. access from my account. She understood the main thing. If someone wanted to set her up, it meant that he used her computer. And there was someone who could help her. Sophie dialed the number, and a minute later she heard a familiar voice. "You shouldn't have called me, Sophie," said Nicholas Sterling, Edward's son. "But you answered anyway. Because I don't believe that you are guilty." She took a deep breath. "Can you help me? If Father finds out." "Nico, you know that I'm telling the truth." There was a pause on the other side. And then he said quietly, "Come in an hour. I know where to start." They met in a small cafeteria, away from the Sterling Global offices. "I can't access the company's servers, but I spoke to the guys in security," Nico said, handing her the printout. Sophie looked at the documents. "Is this a system login log?" "Yes." "Look whose account was used at the same time as yours." She studied the data carefully. The heart began to beat faster. Vivian Hale. "I knew it!" she whispered, clutching the paper in her hands. Nico nodded. "Now you have evidence. But my father won't take my word for it. Then we'll make sure he has no choice." The next day, Sophie returned to the office. She wasn't sure if they would let her in, but Nico allowed her to go in under the pretext of meeting him. But he was not her target. She walked into the finance department and went straight to Vivian, who, upon seeing her, raised her eyebrows in mock surprise. "Sophie? Are you here? I think you're a little lost." Sophie calmly took out the papers and placed them in front of her. "You tried to set me up." Vivian didn't flinch, but a shadow of doubt flickered in her eyes. "What loud accusations?" "I have evidence." She leaned closer. "You used my account. I know that access was at the same moment when you logged into the system. You forgot that the system records all logins." Vivian didn't blink, but she wasn't smiling anymore. "Do you think anyone will believe this? If I tell Edward this, he will have no choice." This time Vivian froze. She realized that she had lost. Half an hour later, Sophie stood in front of Edward's office. He looked up when he saw her, and surprise flashed in his eyes. "You're back." She placed the documents in front of him. "I found out who did it." Edward took the papers and looked through them. "Second. 2. And then his fingers slowly tightened on the sheets. He looked up. "Vivian." The voice was calm, but there was anger in it. Sophie said nothing. She didn't come for confession. But when Edward put the papers down, stood up and walked towards her, she realized that everything had changed. "You were right." He met her gaze, and this time there was no doubt in his eyes. "I was wrong." Sophie took a deep breath. "Yes. And I'm sorry." She didn't expect these words. But she knew he was being sincere. And at that moment she realized that she no longer felt resentment. "What now?" she asked after a long silence. Edward looked at her. "Do you still want to work here?" She thought about it. And then she smiled. "On my own terms." He raised his eyebrows, interested. "Which ones exactly?" "I don't want to be just a subordinate. I want to work on projects that can actually change something." He smiled for the first time in a long time. "I think we can come to an agreement." Sophie got her place in the company, but this time she deserved it. She no longer felt like an outsider. Now she knew that people could doubt. But if you stand for the truth, it will win in the end. And maybe some people are capable of change. Even Edward Sterling.